How one small island ruled a quarter of the earth in the year 1920. If you looked at a map of the world, nearly 1/4 of all the land on earth was colored red. Not because of a plague, not because of a natural disaster, because of a small island off the northwest coast of Europe that had spent 3 centuries deciding, piece by piece and territory by territory, that the world was available. That island had no extraordinary natural resources. It had no massive population advantage. At the moment its empire began to take shape, it was not even the most powerful country in Europe. And yet, by the time that red reached its fullest spread, it touched every continent on Earth. It governed hundreds of millions of people who had never chosen to be governed by it. It moved goods, labor, and ideas across the planet at a scale no single political entity had ever achieved before. This is not a simple story. It is not a story about heroes who brought civilization to people living in darkness. It is also not a story about monsters who destroyed everything they touched. It is something harder and more important than either of those versions. It is the story of how a system was built, how that system was rationalized through law, religion, race, and economics, how it was exported to every corner of the planet, and how it eventually collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions while leaving behind consequences that are still unfolding today. The question at the center of this story is not whether the British Empire was powerful. It clearly was. The question is who that power actually served. And at what point does an empire stop being progress and start being something else entirely? That question does not have a clean answer. But by the time this story is finished, you will have everything you need to answer it for yourself. Chapter 1. The Island That Shouldn't Have Mattered. Picture England in the year 1400. Not the England of Parliament and the BBC. Not the England of Newton and Shakespeare and the Royal Navy. The England of 1400 is a kingdom sitting at the cold, wet, northwestern edge of Europe, looking out at an ocean that England had not yet learned to use as a road to empire. It has just survived one of the worst catastrophes in human history. The Black Death arrived in the 1340s and killed somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the entire population. Not in a single year. Not in a single city, but across the whole island, in village after village, in household after household, until the fields went unplanted and the churches ran out of ground to bury the dead. The social structure that had organized English life for centuries, the feudal order of lords and serfs, and the church sitting above all of it, had been shaken in ways that would take generations to fully understand. At the same time, the 100 Years' War with France was grinding toward its humiliating conclusion for the English side. The army that had won so brilliantly at Agincourt in 1415 under Henry V would eventually be driven out of nearly all its French territories. England was not a continental power. It was barely trying to be one anymore. And at home, the throne itself was contested. The Wars of the Roses, that long and brutal conflict between the House of Lancaster and the House of York, would drag on for decades, killing kings and nobles and anyone unfortunate enough to back the wrong side at the wrong moment. So the question is genuine and it deserves a serious answer. Why this island? Why not Spain, which had a more powerful monarchy and would soon stumble onto an entire hemisphere it did not know existed? Why not Portugal, which was already running trading posts along the African coast and would reach India before any English ship came close? Why not the Dutch, whose merchant capacity and naval innovation would make them the dominant commercial power of the 17th century. Why England? The answer is not a single thing. It is a combination of geography, institution, and what can only be described as a particular kind of adaptive stubbornness that turned weakness into a different kind of strength. Start with the geography, because it shaped everything else. England is an island. That fact sounds simple, but its consequences run very deep. An island cannot be easily invaded. England had not been successfully invaded since 1066, when William the Conqueror crossed the Channel from Normandy and changed everything. After that, the sea was not a barrier to England. It was a wall that required no garrison, no maintenance, and no budget. A wall that worked every hour of every day without anyone having to pay for it. Because England did not need to defend a land border the way France did against its eastern neighbors, or the way the German states did against almost everyone. England did not need to maintain a massive standing army. A standing army requires money. Money requires taxation. Taxation, pushed hard enough and without consent, tends to produce the kind of centralized royal power that crushes the institutions that allow commerce to develop over time. England, protected by water, could afford to let something different develop instead. That something was Parliament. The relationship between the English crown and its nobility and merchant classes had been legally defined since the year 1215. When King John was forced to sign the Magna Carta at a field called Runnymede. That document was not a democratic revolution. Most of its provisions addressed the specific grievances of specific barons who were tired of being taxed and imprisoned without any legal process. It was not written for ordinary people, but the principle embedded in it was genuinely consequential. The king was not above the law. The king could not simply take what he wanted without a process. There were rules, and those rules applied to the ruler too. Over the following 2 centuries, that principle grew into something more structured. Parliament developed, not a parliament in the modern sense, but a body that represented the interests of landowners, merchants, and the church. And that had to be consulted before the crown could raise significant revenue. What this created, almost accidentally, was a relatively stable environment for commerce. Think about what that meant in practice. If you are a merchant in 15th century Europe, the thing that frightens you most is not competition. It is arbitrary power. It is a king deciding that your profits look attractive and simply taking them. It is a war breaking out that destroys the trade route you spent 20 years building. It is a debt owed to you by a nobleman who laughs at the idea of repaying it because he has soldiers and you do not. England was not a paradise for merchants, but compared to many alternatives available at the time, it was somewhat more predictable. Contracts were enforced by courts. Property had legal protections. The rules changed, but they changed through a process rather than through the pure will of whoever happened to be wearing the crown that week. That predictability attracted capital, and capital, accumulating over generations in the hands of merchants who could reinvest rather than simply survive, created the material foundation for the ships, the trading companies, and eventually the armed commercial enterprises that would build the empire. The geography had one more consequence that is easy to overlook. An island that lives by commerce must live by the sea. English merchants who could not expand by land had to learn to sail, and sailing, over time, produces a specific kind of knowledge, the knowledge of wind patterns, of ocean currents, of how to build a ship that can survive open water rather than just hugging a coastline. That knowledge accumulated across generations. It was passed down through fishermen and coastal traders who worked the difficult waters of the North Sea and the English Channel long before anyone in England was thinking about India or Africa or the Americas. The men who would eventually sail to the other side of the world did not appear from nowhere. They were the product of centuries of seamanship developed in waters close to home, in conditions that were cold and dangerous and unforgiving. But geography and institutions alone do not fully explain why England rather than, say, the Netherlands, which had similar commercial advantages and in many ways superior naval technology in the early modern period. Part of the answer is timing, and part of the answer is a religious crisis that turned out, in the long run, to be an unexpected advantage. When Henry VIII broke with Rome in 1533, not for theological reasons, but because the Pope would not grant him a divorce, he did not simply change the religion of his country. He dissolved the monasteries, seized their vast landholdings, and sold that land to the rising merchant and gentry classes at prices that created a new kind of property owner in England. These new landowners had purchased their property from the crown. They had a legal title tied to the English state rather than to the international church. They had every reason to support a strong English state that would protect that title, and every reason to be suspicious of any foreign power, Spanish or papal, that might challenge it. The result was a particular fusion of commercial interest and Protestant national identity that would drive English expansion for the next 2 centuries. The Spanish had conquered the Americas in the name of God and gold. The English would go out into the world as Protestant merchants who believed, with genuine conviction, that commerce and Christianity were the twin engines of civilization. That belief was, in many ways, completely sincere. It was also, as we will see, one of the most effective pieces of ideological cover for exploitation that any empire has ever produced. By the end of the 16th century, England had a relatively stable government, a commercial class with capital to invest, a seafaring population with the skills to cross oceans, and a national story that told its people they were doing God's work when they went out to trade. The empire had not yet begun, but everything needed to build it was in place. What was still missing was practice. And practice, as it always does, came with failure first. The question of when commerce becomes conquest, and when the flag that follows, trade stops being a coincidence and starts being the point, was about to be tested for the first time. In Ireland. Chapter 2. The First Experiments, Ireland, America, and the Art of Failure. Before there was an empire, there were rehearsals, and the rehearsals were disasters. His name was Hugh O'Neill. He was the Earl of Tyrone, and in the 1590s, he came closer to driving the English out of Ireland than any Gaelic leader before or after him. He had been educated partly in England. He knew English military tactics from the inside, and he used that knowledge to organize a resistance across Ulster that stretched the Elizabethan treasury to its limits and kept the most powerful queen in Europe awake, worrying about an island she could see from her own coastline. O'Neill's story begins with what the English were doing in Ireland and why it was generating the resistance that eventually produced him. Ireland had been a target of English ambition since the 12th century. For most of that time, English control was largely theoretical, limited to a strip of territory around Dublin called the Pale. The word passed into the language as a description of the boundary between the acceptable and everything outside it. Beyond the Pale, Gaelic Ireland organized itself according to its own laws and customs. largely indifferent to whatever the English crown claimed from across the water. The Tudor monarchs changed that. Henry VIII and his daughter Elizabeth I decided that Ireland could not be left as it was, a Gaelic, Catholic island sitting so close to England was a strategic threat, a potential landing ground for Spanish forces, a persistent demonstration that English authority had limits it was embarrassed to acknowledge. The solution they reached for was plantation. The plantation system worked like this. English and Scottish settlers were brought in and given land in Ireland. That land was taken from the Gaelic families who had held it, sometimes through legal maneuver, sometimes through military defeat, sometimes through simple confiscation following a rebellion that the new settler presence had helped provoke in the first place. The settlers were expected to be loyal to the crown, to practice Protestantism, and to transform the landscape into something that looked, from an English perspective, like proper civilization. The Gaelic Irish who had previously lived on that land became, at best, tenants' farming ground their families had worked for generations. At worst, they were simply removed. The historian Nicholas Canny, in his detailed study published in 2001, traced how the logic developed in Ireland became the foundational thinking for later colonial ventures. The categories were established in Ireland first. There were civilized people, meaning those who farmed in the English manner, practiced Christianity in the Protestant manner, and submitted to English law. And there were the others, people who needed to be either transformed or displaced. Those categories would travel. They would be applied to the Powhatan Confederacy in Virginia. They would be applied to the peoples of the Australian interior. They would be applied across 3 centuries in forms that changed their specific language while keeping their essential structure intact. O'Neill's War, the 9 Years' War of 1593 to 1603, was the result of those categories meeting sustained and organized resistance. His forces won remarkable victories in open battle. They drew on alliances across Gaelic Ireland. They received support from Spain. And for a period that must have seemed genuinely alarming in London, they came very close to succeeding. The English response was overwhelming. Lord Mountjoy, the commander sent to crush the rebellion, pursued a scorched earth strategy that destroyed crops and livestock across large parts of Ulster, producing a famine that killed far more people than the fighting itself. Contemporary accounts describe a landscape emptied of human life across entire regions. O'Neill was eventually defeated. He surrendered in 1603, just days after Elizabeth died, without knowing the war was over. He later went into exile in what became known as the Flight of the Earls. His lands were confiscated for the Ulster plantation that would shape the politics of Ireland, and eventually of Northern Ireland, for the next 4 centuries and beyond. The lesson that should have been learned from the Irish experience was this: people resist dispossession with a determination that makes conquest enormously expensive and occupation more expensive still. The lesson that was actually learned was different. The conclusion drawn was that the methods needed to be more thorough, the plantation more complete, the removal of resistant populations more systematic. That conclusion, shaped in the fields of Ulster, would travel to Virginia, to Bengal, to Kenya, and to dozens of other places across the following 3 centuries. While Ireland was being processed through this template, English eyes were also turning westward. The Spanish had been in the Americas since 1492. By the mid-16th century, they had extracted quantities of silver and gold from their American territories that had literally changed the price of money across Europe. The English watch this with the particular intensity of people who believe they are missing out on something important. The first English attempts to establish a permanent presence in North America were private ventures, financed by investors who hoped the returns would justify the risks. They did not, at least not at first. The Roanoke Colony, established on the coast of what is now North Carolina in 1585 and again in 1587, simply disappeared. When a supply ship returned in 1590, after a delay caused by the war with Spain, the settlement was empty. The colonists were gone. No credible explanation has ever been established. The word Croatoan carved on a post was the only evidence left behind. Roanoke became a ghost story, but it was also a data point, establishing a colony on the other side of an ocean, in territory whose conditions you do not fully understand, with a supply line that takes months to traverse, is extraordinarily difficult. Jamestown, established in Virginia in 1607, nearly repeated the outcome. Consider what the first settlers found. They had chosen a marshy, mosquito-ridden location, surrounded by brackish water unsuitable for drinking. They arrived in the wrong season for planting. Many of them had no agricultural skills relevant to the conditions they faced. Of the roughly 104 men who arrived in May of 1607, more than half were dead by the following winter. In the winter of 1609 to 1610, known to survivors as the starving time, the settlement lost more than 400 of its 500 colonists to starvation, disease, and violence. One account from that winter, preserved in colonial records, describes conditions so desperate that survivors resorted to eating leather, rats, and in at least one documented case, the bodies of those who had already died. It is not a story that appears in most celebrations of the colonial founding. Jamestown survived, barely, because of tobacco. John Rolfe experimented with a strain of tobacco that proved marketable to European buyers. By 1616, the Virginia venture was financially viable. The colony had found its commodity. And with a commodity came investment. With investment came more settlers. With more settlers came the pressure for more land. And with the pressure for more land came the violent displacement of the Powhatan Confederacy. The people whose knowledge and occasional assistance had helped keep the English alive in those first desperate winters. The pattern that had played out in Ireland played out again in Virginia. The people who made early survival possible were eventually dispossessed by the success that their presence had made possible. There is something almost mechanical about this. Looking back, not because the individuals involved were uniquely cruel, though cruelty was certainly present, but because the economic logic of the colonial venture, once it found a commodity that worked, generated pressures that consistently produced the same outcomes regardless of who was making the specific decisions. You need land to grow tobacco. The land has people on it. Those people have their own understanding of who the land belongs to. That understanding is incompatible with your commercial operation. Therefore, in the logic of the system, the people must go. The English were developing the institutional and ideological infrastructure to execute that logic more systematically, more durably, and eventually at a much larger scale than anyone in the early 17th century could have imagined. That infrastructure included something that would become one of the most consequential financial inventions in the history of capitalism: the joint stock company, the Virginia Company, which funded the Jamestown expedition, allowed investors to buy shares in a colonial venture, share in its profits if it succeeded, and lose only what they had invested if it failed. This mechanism spread risk across many investors and made it possible to finance extraordinarily expensive long-distance ventures that no single individual or even most governments could fund alone. It was a genuinely brilliant financial innovation. It was also the mechanism that would eventually produce the East India Company. And the East India Company would produce something that no one who designed the joint stock mechanism had imagined or intended. It would produce a corporation that conquered a continent. The empire had learned from its failures in Ireland and Virginia. It had developed a template, and now it had a vehicle powerful enough to carry that template to the other side of the world. What commerce and religion had begun, capital was about to finish. Chapter 3. The corporation that conquered a continent, the East India Company. There is a moment in the life of Robert Clive that tells you almost everything you need to know about how the British Empire actually worked. He was 25 years old. He was in India, a long way from the minor Shropshire family that had produced him and from the string of failures that had defined his life up to that point. He was about to lead a small force of 200 soldiers, mostly Indian, against a garrison of several thousand defending the city of Arcot in southern India. By any rational calculation, the attack should not have succeeded. Clive had no formal military training. His men were outnumbered many times over. The city's defenders had every physical advantage. But Clive had something that rational calculation does not fully account for. He was under pressure, completely without fear. And in the chaos of the assault, that quality proved more decisive than the numbers. Arcot fell. Clive became, almost overnight, a figure of legend in British India. And the man who had come to the subcontinent as a clerk because he had run out of other options became the instrument through which one of the most extraordinary transfers of power in human history would take place. To understand how that transfer happened, you have to go back to the beginning of the company that employed him. The East India Company received its royal charter from Queen Elizabeth I on the last day of the year 1600. Its stated purpose was trade with the East Indies, the spice-producing islands of Southeast Asia already being contested by the Portuguese and the Dutch. Pepper, nutmeg, cloves, and cinnamon were not luxury items in the modern sense. They were essential for food preservation in a world without refrigeration, and they commanded prices in European markets that made the risks of the voyage seem worthwhile. The early decades were difficult. The Dutch, who had a head start, effectively shut the English out of the most profitable spice islands. The company pivoted toward India, where the Mughal Empire controlled a vast, sophisticated economy producing textiles that European markets wanted, and where the English could establish trading posts, called factories, with the permission of local rulers. The key word is permission. In the early 17th century, the East India Company was a guest in India, a commercially useful guest, bringing silver and taking out textiles, but a guest nonetheless. The Mughal Empire under Akbar and his successors was one of the wealthiest and most sophisticated political entities on earth. Its cities were larger than anything in contemporary Europe. Its administrative systems were more elaborate. Its textile production was the envy of the world. The English merchants, who established their first trading post at Surat in 1608, did so by negotiating with Mughal officials. They sought permission. They paid duties. They operated within a system that was not their own. Thomas Roux, who served as the English ambassador to the Mughal court of Emperor Jahangir from 1615 to 1619, wrote back to his employers with advice that proved prophetic in ways he did not intend. It is the wisest course. He wrote, "To trade rather than to plant. The attempt to establish territorial control," he argued, "would consume any profits the trade generated." The company ignored that advice. Eventually, but it took more than a century for the logic of trade to give way entirely to the logic of conquest. And the transition, when it came, was driven not by grand strategy in London, but by a specific kind of opportunity that presented itself when the Mughal Empire began to fracture. That fracture had been developing since the death of Emperor Aurangzeb in 1707. The great empire that had seemed so permanent began to break apart as regional powers asserted independence. Persian forces under Nader Shah sacked Delhi in 1739, carrying off the peacock throne and vast quantities of wealth. A raid that announced to everyone watching that the center could no longer protect even itself. The dissolution that Aurangzeb's death had begun accelerated sharply in the decades that followed. Into that instability stepped the East India Company. The company did not conquer India in a single campaign. It accumulated power opportunistically, one treaty at a time, one battlefield at a time. It played regional rulers against each other. It offered military assistance to one side in a local conflict, and then presented a bill for that assistance that the recipient could not pay, accepting territory or trading rights in lieu of cash. It identified rulers who were willing to cooperate and prop them up, and identified rulers who were not and found reasons to remove them. The historian William Dalrymple, in his deeply researched account published in 2019, described the company's expansion as a corporate takeover of a subcontinent. The decisions that determined the fate of millions of people were made in boardrooms by men whose primary obligation was to their shareholders in London, not to the populations they were coming to govern. And then Clive arrived in force. By 1757, Clive had risen from that improbable victory at Arcot to become the company's most effective military commander in Bengal, the richest province in India. Bengal had a new ruler, Siraj-ud-Dawla, who had grown alarmed at the company's expanding military presence and had moved against its Calcutta trading post. Clive was sent to restore company interests. What he chose to do went considerably further than restoration. The Battle of Plassey on the 23rd of June, 1757, was not primarily a military engagement. It was a conspiracy dressed as a battle. Before a single soldier moved, Clive had made secret arrangements with Mir Jafar, one of Siraj-ud-Dawla's most senior generals, who agreed to betray his commander in exchange for the leadership of Bengal itself. When the battle began, Mir Jafar's forces stood aside. The Nawab's army, confused and without effective leadership, collapsed. Siraj-ud-Dawla fled and was later killed by agents of Mir Jafar. Clive had conquered Bengal through a combination of military threat and commercial bribery. What followed was not administration. It was extraction. The company, now functioning as the effective sovereign of Bengal, collected taxes from the population while simultaneously eliminating the Indian merchants and manufacturers who had previously competed with its commercial operations. The weavers of Bengal, who had produced textiles sold across the world, found themselves forced to sell exclusively to the company at prices the company dictated. The deindustrialization that followed was not an accident. It was a structural outcome of the company's commercial dominance. Clive himself took a personal fortune from the Bengal treasury that by various estimates ran into hundreds of thousands of pounds sterling in the money of the time. His colleagues took proportionally. The practice was so common that a word entered the English language to describe the men who returned from India with sudden, inexplicable wealth. They were called nabobs. The word was an anglicization of Nawab, the title of the Indian rulers the company had replaced. When Clive was eventually called before the British Parliament to account for his conduct, he offered a defense that has echoed through imperial history in various forms ever since. He pointed out that he had been surrounded by riches on a scale that no Englishman before him had encountered, that the treasury of an ancient civilization had been effectively at his disposal, and that in those circumstances he considered himself, with all due respect to the assembled parliamentarians, astonished at his own moderation. Parliament deliberated. It censured him in form and cleared him in substance. The profits were too large, the precedents too useful, the men who had benefited too numerous. Clive died in 1774, possibly by his own hand. He left behind a Bengal that had been transformed from the most prosperous province of the most powerful empire in Asia into a territory whose revenues were being drained to London, whose industries were being dismantled to benefit British manufacturers, and whose population faced a famine within 2 decades that historians continue to debate in its causes and scale, but not in its catastrophic human cost. The company continued to expand. Over the following decades, the subsidiary alliance system, developed by the Marquess of Wellesley in the late 1790s, converted Indian rulers into tributaries who hosted company troops at their own expense and who found, when they could not pay or when they objected to company policies, that the protection those troops provided came with conditions amounting to the effective loss of sovereignty. By 1818, following the defeat of the Maratha Confederacy, the company had no serious military rival on the subcontinent. The governor-generals in Calcutta now governed, directly or through subsidiary alliances, a territory containing more people than all of Europe. In London, the company's shareholders collected their dividends. The arrangement might have continued indefinitely, but empires built on extraction accumulate grievances faster than they accumulate profits. And in 1857, those grievances found a trigger. The immediate cause was a cartridge. The company had introduced new rifle cartridges whose paper casing had to be bitten before loading. The rumor spread, with considerable evidence behind it, that the grease on the cartridges was made from cow and pig fat, prohibited by Hindu and Muslim practice respectively. The company's sepoys, its Indian soldiers, were being asked to put their mouths to something their religious traditions forbade. The mutiny that began at Meerut in May of 1857 was the cartridge. The powder behind it had been building for a century of company rule. Entire regiments joined the uprising. The old Mughal emperor, Bahadur Shah Zafar, elderly and largely without real power, but enormously symbolic, was proclaimed a leader of the resistance. Company control across large parts of northern India collapsed within weeks. The British response was overwhelming. The suppression of the uprising involved mass executions and reprisals that contemporary witnesses described in terms that did not fit the civilizing mission narrative the company had built its reputation on. By 1858, the uprising had been crushed, and in that same year, the British Parliament dissolved the East India Company entirely, transferring its territories, its armies, and its administrative functions to the British Crown. Queen Victoria was proclaimed Empress of India 19 years later. The fiction was over. What the company had built over 2.5 centuries of commercial aggression, military expansion, and systematic extraction was now officially British imperial territory. The private enterprise of conquest had been nationalized. The East India Company was gone. The system it had built was not. And, running in parallel with the India story, for more than a century, was another system entirely. One that did not deal in territory, one that dealt in human beings. The question of when an empire stops being progress had an answer ready. It was there in the hold of every ship that crossed the Atlantic. It had been there from the beginning. Chapter 4: Sugar, Slaves, and the Economy of Brutality. Her name was Mary Prince. She was born in Bermuda around 1788, the property of a Captain Williams, who gave her as a gift to his daughter on her wedding day. She was sold 3 times before she was 30. She worked in the salt ponds of Turk's Island, standing in brine up to her knees for hours at a time until the skin cracked and bled. She was beaten regularly. She watched other enslaved people beaten to death for offenses that would not have warranted a reprimand among free workers. In 1828, she came to London with the family that owned her. In London, she was technically on free soil. She walked out. She dictated her story to a Quaker woman named Susanna Strickland, and in 1831 it was published as The History of Mary Prince, the first account of the life of an enslaved black woman to be published in Britain. It sold 3 editions in its first year. It was read in Parliament. It was entered as evidence in the debate over slavery that would produce the Slavery Abolition Act 2 years later. Mary Prince is not a footnote in the history of British slavery. She is one of its most direct witnesses. And her story opens this chapter because what happened to her was not exceptional within the system she lived inside. It was the system operating as designed. That system was built on a word that appears throughout the financial records of 18th century Britain in a way that, if you know how to read those records, is almost impossible to ignore. Sugar. It appears in the investment portfolios of members of Parliament. It appears in the account books of London merchants who had never set foot in the Caribbean. It appears in the correspondence of insurance companies at Lloyd's of London that underwrote the ships that carried it. It appears in the wills of aristocratic families whose country estates were financed by it. And behind every entry involving sugar, if you follow the chain back far enough, you find another word: slavery. The economic historian Eric Williams argued in his foundational study, published in 1944, that the profits of Caribbean slavery provided critical capital for the Industrial Revolution. Williams was from Trinidad, and his argument was contested by some British historians for decades, with the contestation sometimes reflecting genuine scholarly disagreement and sometimes reflecting the discomfort of the conclusion itself. Subsequent research, including detailed work by Brion Davis and more recent studies tracing specific investment flows from colonial profits into British industrial development, has broadly supported the core of Williams's argument while adding significant nuance. The relationship between slave-produced wealth and British industrialization was not a simple direct transfer. It was more diffuse, more embedded in the financial system, and in some ways more disturbing for being so. Slave-produced sugar-financed insurance companies that financed shipping, that financed manufacturing. It financed banks that financed land purchases, that financed political careers, that shaped colonial policy. It was not a separate part of the British economy. It was woven through the fabric of it. To understand how this happened, you have to go back to the moment when the Caribbean colonies transformed from tobacco-growing settlements into something far more lucrative and far more brutal. Sugarcane cultivation and processing was extraordinarily labor-intensive. It required workers in sufficient numbers and under sufficient compulsion to make large-scale production viable. Indentured servants from England, who had provided some of the labor for the earlier tobacco economy, were not adequate in number, and they had the inconvenient legal status of people whose indenture eventually ended. Enslaved Africans, from the perspective of the planter class, had none of these limitations. They could be purchased outright. They could be worked without the constraints that even minimal legal protections for indentured servants provided. They appeared in inventories alongside livestock and agricultural equipment. The Royal African Company, chartered by King Charles II in 1672, was given a monopoly on the English slave trade. The royal family held shares. Members of the court invested. The trade was not an underground operation conducted by morally disreputable outsiders. It was a royally chartered, governmentally supported commercial enterprise. When the Royal African Company's monopoly was broken in 1698 and the trade was open to any English merchant who wished to participate, the volume expanded dramatically. Bristol, London, and Liverpool developed into major slave trading ports whose prosperity was built substantially on this commerce. The ships that left those harbors carried manufactured goods to West Africa, traded those goods for enslaved people, transported those people across the Atlantic, and sold the survivors in Caribbean and American markets before returning to Britain with sugar, tobacco, and rum. This was the triangular trade. It is a phrase that appears in school curricula in a way that sometimes sanitizes the reality it describes. Consider what the Middle Passage actually was. Enslaved people were chained together in spaces so confined that movement was impossible for weeks at a time. In tropical heat, in their own waste, with inadequate water and food, surrounded by others dying of disease and despair. The crossing typically lasted 6 to 8 weeks. The Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, compiled over decades by historians including David Eltis and David Richardson from shipping records across multiple archives, indicates that somewhere between 15 and 20% of enslaved people did not survive the crossing at all. Those who survived arrived having endured something that no description fully captures, and were sold at auction, separated from anyone they knew, and put to work under a regime calibrated not to their well-being, but to maximum productive output. The conditions on the sugar plantations of Jamaica, Barbados, and the other British Caribbean islands were so severe that the enslaved population could not sustain itself through natural reproduction. The death rate exceeded the birth rate. The plantation system required the continuous importation of new enslaved people simply to maintain the labor force. This fact was known to everyone involved in the system. It was known to the merchants in Bristol. It was known to the insurance companies that wrote policies on the human cargo. It was known to the members of Parliament who represented the planting interest. It was known to the economists and theologians who debated the trade in pamphlets and coffeehouses. The system continued because the financial returns were substantial enough that the political will to end it took more than a century and a half to develop. Despite evidence of its violence being extensively documented and available in the public record throughout that period, that ideological framework that made this possible was not accidental. The intellectual case for racial hierarchy was developed by philosophers, scientists, and clergymen who were respected members of British society. It was constructed, refined, and distributed through the same cultural institutions that produced British science and British theology. But here is what that framework could not fully suppress. Mary Prince, Olaudah Equiano, whose memoir, published in 1789, described enslavement from the inside and became a best-selling work in Britain. Ignatius Sancho, whose letters were published in 1782. These were people who had survived what the system was designed to make unsurvivable, who had found voices in the language of their enslavers, and who used those voices to testify to what they had experienced. The arguments against slavery were available. They were heard. They were, for a long time, outweighed by the money. The abolition movement that eventually ended the British slave trade in 1807 and British slavery itself in 1833 is often told as a story of moral triumph. That story is true as far as it goes. William Wilberforce, Thomas Clarkson, and, crucially, the many enslaved and formerly enslaved people whose testimony and organizing made the movement possible, were engaged in genuine moral struggle against powerful and well-funded opposition. But the story as it is usually told leaves out two things that significantly complicate the triumphant version. The first is that abolition of the slave trade in 1807 did not end slavery in British territories. It ended the legal trade in new enslaved people. The existing enslaved population remained enslaved. The plantation system continued. The profits continued. It took another 26 years for slavery itself to be abolished in British colonial territories. The second is what happened when slavery was finally abolished. The British government paid compensation to slave owners for the loss of their human property, £20 million, a sum representing a very substantial fraction of the British government's annual revenue at the time, was distributed to the people who had enslaved other human beings. The debt taken on to fund this compensation was so large that British taxpayers were reportedly still servicing elements of it into the 21st century, a claim that generated considerable public attention when the Treasury noted it on its social media account in 2015. The people who had been enslaved received nothing. They were simply free. Free in territories whose economies had been entirely structured around their exploitation, with no capital, no land rights, and a political system that remained in the hands of the people who had previously owned them. Mary Prince did not live to see abolition. She disappears from the historical record after 1833. We do not know where she went. We do not know how her life ended. What we know is that she walked out of a house in London one day in 1828 because the law of the land she was standing on said she could. And then she told her story. The sugar in the British cup of tea was not a simple commodity. It was the product of a system of organized human suffering sustained across more than a century and a half. The profits it generated did not disappear with abolition. They were already invested in the banks, the textile mills, and the railway companies that were building the industrial Britain of the 19th century. Mary Prince had named what the system was. She had done it in the clearest language available to any witness. The question the empire could not afford to answer honestly was the same question she had been asking all along. Who does this serve? The empire continued east. 300 million people in India were living inside the same question, and some of them were already writing down the answer with remarkable precision. Chapter 5. The Raj when Britain decided it owned India. In the spring of 1859, a man named Syed Ahmad Khan sat down to write a document that would take him 2 years to complete. He had survived the uprising of 1857. He had watched British reprisals against Muslim communities in the Delhi region with a horror he did not try to conceal. He had also watched the uprising itself with deep misgivings, believing that the violence would produce consequences for Indian Muslims that would outlast the fighting by generations. The document he produced, published in 1859 as The Causes of the Indian Mutiny, did something almost no Indian writer of his time dared to do. It told the British government, in careful and respectful language, exactly what it had done wrong. It had failed to understand the people it was governing. It had made decisions affecting the religious and cultural life of hundreds of millions of people without consulting those people. It had constructed an administrative system that was, in Syed Ahmad Khan's analysis, generating the very resistance it was then surprised to encounter. The British read his document. Some officials found it useful. None of them fundamentally changed the system he was describing. Syed Ahmad Khan spent the rest of his life working within British India to improve opportunities for Muslim Indians, founding a college that would eventually become Aligarh Muslim University. He was knighted by the British government. He remained, until his death in 1898, a man who had told power exactly what was wrong with itself and had been listened to just enough to be honored and not enough to be heeded. His story is where this chapter begins because it establishes something important. Goal. From the moment the Crown took formal control of India in 1858, there were Indian voices telling the administration with precision and intelligence exactly what the system was doing. The failure that followed was not a failure of information. It was a failure of will. To understand what those voices were responding to, you have to understand what the Raj actually was, as experienced by the people living under it rather than by the officials administering it. The Raj was, at its most basic level, a system in which the revenues of the Indian subcontinent were used to fund the administration that governed the subcontinent, including the cost of the army that kept it under control, and to service the interest on the capital that British investors had deployed in Indian railways, telegraphs, and public works. This arrangement meant that a significant portion of what India produced was being transferred to Britain not through trade, but through the administrative structure of colonial governance itself. Dadabhai Naoroji, who became the first Indian member of the British Parliament in 1892, called this the drain of wealth. His calculations, and the later and more comprehensive calculations by the economist Utsa Patnaik, whose methodology has been strongly debated by other scholars, attempted to quantify what that drain represented over the full period of British rule. The specific numbers are contested in economic history and should be understood as estimates subject to ongoing scholarly debate. But the basic direction of the argument, that the colonial economic relationship transferred substantial resources from India to Britain rather than investing them in Indian economic development, has been supported by subsequent research, even where specific calculations are disputed. The railways illuminate the dynamic with particular clarity. India did get an extensive railway network. By 1914, it was one of the largest in the world, and British officials pointed to it with genuine pride as evidence of the developmental benefits of colonial administration. The nationalist critique, articulated clearly by Gandhi and others, was that the railways were designed primarily to move goods from the interior to the ports for export, and to move British troops rapidly across the subcontinent in the event of unrest. The interest on the capital used to build the railways was guaranteed by the Indian taxpayer, meaning that even when individual lines failed commercially, British investors were protected from loss at Indian public expense. The railways were real. They connected distant regions. They carried people as well as goods, but who they were built for, and who bore the costs, and who collected the profits, has a documented answer in the administrative record that complicates the straightforward developmental narrative. The administrative apparatus that governed India under the Raj selected its members through competitive examination, a meritocratic approach more advanced than the patronage-based systems common in many European governments at the time. Those officials were trained to learn Indian languages and to administer justice with consistency. They were also, with rare exceptions, until very late in the Raj's history, British. The examinations were held in London and tested knowledge that created practical barriers, ensuring senior positions remained overwhelmingly British-held throughout most of the Raj's existence. Consider a district officer in the Punjab in the 1880s. He knew the local language. He had read the ancient texts of the civilization he was administering. He believed sincerely that he was doing his best for the people under his authority. And in many individual cases, that belief was not empty. He was also the representative of a government that extracted taxes from those people, made major decisions about their economic arrangements without their consent, and would call in the military if necessary to enforce compliance. Sincerity and exploitation are not mutually exclusive. The history of the Raj is largely the history of their coexistence. The famines that struck India under British rule provide the sharpest test of the claim that the Raj governed in Indian interests. In 1876 to 1879, a famine in southern and western India killed somewhere between 6 and 10 million people, with estimates varying across different scholarly sources. The journalist and historian Mike Davis, in his study of Victorian-era famines published in 2001, documented specific policy decisions made during that crisis, including the continuation of grain exports from India to Britain and the rejection of relief measures on the grounds that they would interfere with market mechanisms. Davis argued that these decisions significantly worsened outcomes beyond what drought and agricultural failure alone would have produced. Other historians have emphasized the genuine constraints facing administrators and disputed specific elements of Davis's analysis. The scholarly debate about specific decisions and their consequences is real and ongoing. The Bengal famine of 1943 is the most intensively debated case. Somewhere between 2 and 3 million people died of starvation in Bengal in that year. In the middle of a world war, the Indian population had been recruited to support. The broad parameters are not seriously disputed. The famine occurred in a region that was producing food. The people who died lacked the money to buy it, in part because wartime inflation had destroyed purchasing power, and in part because food was being moved out of Bengal to support the war effort. The economist Amartya Sen, in his foundational analysis, published in 1981, argued that this was a famine caused not by a shortage of food, but by a collapse in the entitlements of specific groups to acquire food, a distinction with significant policy implications. The Churchill government in London was informed of the crisis. The response documented in cabinet minutes and in the accounts of Leo Amery, the Secretary of State for India, who was present at those discussions, was not one that the available documentation suggests was fully engaged with the scale of what was happening. Churchill's own recorded statements on the matter have been the subject of considerable historical analysis and debate, with some historians arguing that wartime constraints genuinely limited what was possible, and others arguing that specific decisions made the catastrophe significantly worse than it needed to be. The debate is genuine, and the evidence is genuinely complex. What is documented and not seriously disputed is that the people who died were Indian. The decisions that shaped the famine were made by British officials, and those officials had information and authority that they could have used differently. Against these realities, the genuine contributions of the Raj must be measured honestly. The legal codification introduced by British administrators created more consistent standards of justice in some respects. though it operated within a fundamentally unequal system. The census operations and administrative surveys produced remarkable records that Indian scholars have drawn on for generations. The English language, introduced as the medium of elite administration and education, became a tool that Indian nationalists turned against the administration that had imposed it, a vehicle for communication across the subcontinent's extraordinary linguistic diversity. Jawaharlal Nehru wrote his remarkable account of Indian civilization, The Discovery of India, in English, while imprisoned in Ahmadnagar Fort by the government that claimed to govern India in Indian interests. The language of the colonizer became, in his hands, a means of dismantling the justifications for colonization. That irony is characteristic of the Raj. Almost nothing about it was simple. But Syed Ahmad Khan had seen the core of it clearly in 1859. The system had been imposed without consent. The failure was not a failure of information. It was a failure of will. He had told power exactly what was wrong with itself. And power had listened just enough to honor him, and not enough to change. The empire continued. It always continued. And beyond the borders of India, across the ocean and into the southern hemisphere, the same system was being applied in a different form, with a different logic, and with consequences that were in some ways even harder to undo. Chapter 6. The White Empire Settler Colonialism in Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. On the 7th of February, 1840, a Palawa man named Tuner Minnerwaite was hanged in Melbourne. He was 32 or 33 years old. He had come from Van Diemen's Land, the island that the British had renamed Tasmania, as part of an experiment organized by a protector of Aborigines named George Robinson, who believed that bringing Tasmanian Aboriginal people to the mainland might produce some useful result for the colonial project. The experiment was not well designed, and it did not account for what Tuner Minnerwaite would find when he arrived. What he found was a colony in the process of taking land from its inhabitants at a pace and with a violence that was daily and visible. He responded to what he saw. He was hanged, alongside another Palawa man named Mulboyhinner, in what was the first civil execution in the Port Phillip district of the colony that would eventually become the state of Victoria. His name does not appear in most histories of the British Empire. By the time of his execution, the Aboriginal population of Van Diemen's Land had already experienced something that historians have described in terms that have no comfortable equivalent in the standard vocabulary of colonial history. The Black War of the 1820s, a series of violent conflicts between settlers and Aboriginal people, had been followed by the forced removal of virtually the entire surviving Aboriginal population to Flinders Island. There, disease and despair reduced a people who had lived on that island for tens of thousands of years to a few dozen survivors. Tuner Minnerwaite had come from a place where that had already happened. His story opens this chapter because it captures, in one specific life, what the general concept of settler colonialism actually meant in practice, not as policy, not as ideology, as something that happened to a specific person who had a name and an age and a place of origin, and who died at the end of a rope in a colony that had been declared empty of any prior claim. Not every territory the British acquired was governed the same way. The India of the East India Company and the Raj was an extractive colony, a territory whose existing population was governed and taxed and economically managed in the interest of the metropole. The relationship was exploitative, but it was a relationship. The people were there. They were hundreds of millions, and the system needed them to keep the economy running. The colonies of Australia Canada and New Zealand were something structurally different. They were settler colonies. And the distinction matters enormously, because the logic of settler colonialism is not the logic of extraction. It is the logic of replacement. In an extractive colony, the indigenous population is, within the brutal calculus of empire, necessary. In a settler colony, the indigenous population is an obstacle. The settlers do not need their labor, because the settlers themselves provide the labor. The goal is not to govern the people, but to occupy the land they live on. That logic was not always stated openly. It was often wrapped in the language of civilization, of Christianity, of the paternalistic claim that indigenous people would be better off once assimilated into European ways of life. But beneath the language, the structural reality was consistent across 3 continents and multiple centuries. The land was wanted. The people on the land were in the way. When the first fleet arrived at Botany Bay in January of 1788, carrying 778 convicts and their military guards, the continent they were landing on was not empty. It had been inhabited for at least 65,000 years, making the Aboriginal peoples of Australia among the oldest continuous cultures on Earth. The population at the time of British arrival is estimated by modern scholars at somewhere between 300,000 and 1 million people, speaking hundreds of distinct languages, organized into complex societies with sophisticated knowledge of the land, the seasons, and the resources the continent provided. The British doctrine that justified claiming this land was called terra nullius, a Latin phrase meaning land belonging to no one. The doctrine held that because Aboriginal Australians did not farm in the European manner and did not have legal title to the land in any form, the British legal system recognized the continent was effectively unoccupied and available for British sovereignty. The land was not empty. The doctrine was not designed to describe reality. It was designed to provide legal cover for taking the land. And in that function, it served its purpose for nearly 2 centuries. Terra nullius was not formally overturned in Australian law until the Mabo decision of 1992, in which the High Court finally recognized that Aboriginal people had possessed legal rights to the land before British sovereignty was declared. The human cost of what followed between 1788 and the early 20th century was catastrophic. Disease played the largest role. Smallpox reached the Aboriginal population of the Sydney region within 2 years of the first fleet's arrival, killing large proportions of communities whose immune systems had no prior exposure. The pattern repeated across the continent as settlement expanded. But disease was not the whole story. As settlers pushed into new territories in search of grazing land, they encountered Aboriginal communities whose connection to those lands went back beyond any European frame of reference. The conflicts that followed are documented in colonial records, in missionary accounts, and in the oral traditions of Aboriginal communities that survived. The historian Lyndall Ryan and her colleagues, in compiling the Colonial Frontier Massacres database, have documented more than 400 distinct massacre events affecting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people between 1788 and 1930. The specific numbers remain subject to ongoing scholarly examination because the record-keeping was deliberately incomplete. The general pattern is not in dispute. The survivors of this process were not left to reconstitute their communities. Aboriginal people were moved onto missions and reserves, removed from lands they had managed for generations, prohibited from speaking their own languages, and subjected to administrative control that covered almost every aspect of daily life. And then there were the children. The policy of removing Aboriginal children from their families, placing them in institutions or with white families, and training them for domestic service while systematically severing their connections to language, culture, and family. Operated across Australia from the late 19th century through to the 1970s. This was not a fringe policy. It was formal government policy, authorized by legislation, funded by public money, and implemented by government departments whose records are preserved in Australian archives. The children who were taken, and their descendants, are known as the stolen generations. The Bringing Them Home report, published by the Australian Human Rights Commission in 1997, documented the experiences of survivors in careful and specific detail. The report did not deal in abstractions. It dealt in accounts given by people who had been taken as children, who had grown up without their families, without their languages, without the country that gave their lives meaning in ways the English word country does not fully capture. In 2008, Prime Minister Kevin Rudd delivered a formal apology to the stolen generations on behalf of the Australian government. The word sorry was spoken. The material consequences of the policy, the disrupted communities, the lost languages, the intergenerational trauma documented by health researchers across the country, did not change with the apology. The apology was significant. Its limitations were acknowledged by many of the people it was addressed to. Canada followed a variant of the same pattern, with its own specific institutional mechanism. The residential school system that operated in Canada from the 1870s through to 1996 removed Indigenous children from their families and placed them in church-run schools funded by the federal government. The explicit goal, stated in official documents, was to eliminate Indigenous culture. Duncan Campbell Scott, the government official who oversaw the system in the early 20th century, described the policy's aim as killing the Indian in the child. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, which took testimony from survivors between 2008 and 2015, documented in careful detail what those schools had been and what they had done. The Commission's final report used the words cultural genocide to describe the residential school system. In 2021, the remains of 215 children were discovered buried at the site of a former residential school in Kamloops, British Columbia. Subsequent searches at other former school sites found hundreds more. The discoveries prompted a national reckoning that is still unfolding. New Zealand offers the most complicated version of the settler colonial story in the British Empire, and the complications are genuinely instructive rather than simply convenient. The Treaty of Waitangi, signed in 1840 between the British Crown and Maori chiefs, is unusual in the history of British colonial encounters because it was a real treaty, negotiated in both English and Maori. But the two versions were not identical in their meaning, and the difference turned out to matter enormously. The English version ceded sovereignty to the British Crown. The Maori version used a word that the chiefs who signed it understood to mean something closer to governance or administration, preserving their own authority over their lands and their people. They understood themselves to be entering a relationship of shared authority, not surrendering their autonomy. The subsequent history of New Zealand is largely the history of that gap being exploited by the settler government while being contested by Maori communities who understood themselves to have retained rights the Crown was violating. By the early 20th century, Maori had lost the vast majority of the land they had held at the time of the treaty. The population had declined severely from the effects of introduced disease and the disruption of warfare. The cultural and political institutions that had organized Maori life before colonization had been substantially dismantled. And yet New Zealand is also the country where the indigenous experience of colonization has been most consistently engaged with through ongoing legal and political processes. The Waitangi Tribunal, established in 1975, has heard thousands of claims from Maori communities seeking redress for treaty violations. Its findings have resulted in settlements and returned resources on a scale that has no real equivalent in Australia or Canada. This is not a reason for complacency. Many of the most significant grievances remain unresolved. But the existence of an ongoing legal process that takes Maori rights seriously as treaty rights is a structural difference that matters. Across all three settler colonies, there is a question that has become increasingly urgent in contemporary politics. These countries have been independent of Britain for generations. Their governments are their own. The British government that authorized the original dispossession no longer exists in the form that carried it out, and yet the outcomes of that dispossession persist in measurable form. Aboriginal Australians have lower life expectancy, higher rates of incarceration, and worse health outcomes than non-Aboriginal Australians by margins that have not significantly closed despite decades of official attention. Indigenous Canadians live with similar measurable disadvantages. These are not outcomes that can be explained by present-day individual prejudice alone. They are structural outcomes, the accumulated result of policies that deliberately dismantled Indigenous societies, took their land, severed their family connections, and suppressed their languages and cultures across multiple generations. The countries built on that foundation are, by many measures, prosperous and stable democracies. They also carry within them an unresolved account that their own founding documents, in several cases, acknowledge but have not settled. Tunner Minnerwaite was hanged on a Tuesday morning in February of 1840. He was 32 years old. He had come from an island whose people had lived there for tens of thousands of years and had been reduced, within a single human lifetime of British settlement, to a handful of survivors. He did not choose to be part of the British Empire. The British Empire chose him. The question of when empire stops being progress and starts being something else entirely did not require an answer in the abstract. In the places where settler colonialism operated, the answer was visible on the ground. In the land that changed hands, in the children that were taken, in the languages that fell silent. The British Empire was still expanding when Tunner Minnerwaite died. The lines it was drawing across the world were not finished yet. Africa was next. And there, the lines would be drawn not on the ground, but on paper, in a room in Berlin, by men who had never walked the land they were dividing. Chapter 7. Africa Divided, the Berlin Conference, and the Lines That Still Bleed. His name was Kabiyesi Kosoko, and in 1851 he was the ruler of Lagos. He was not, by the standards of the day, an easy man to deal with. He had taken the Lagos throne through a succession dispute that involved considerable violence. He maintained commercial relationships with slave traders at a time when Britain had officially abolished the slave trade and was deploying its West Africa Squadron to intercept slave ships along the coast. He was suspicious of British intentions. And he had reason to be. The British consul John Beecroft arrived at Lagos in November of 1851 with a small naval force and a demand that Kosoko step down in favor of a rival claimant named Akitoye, who had agreed to sign a treaty abolishing the slave trade and opening Lagos to British commerce. Kosoko refused. The British bombarded Lagos for 2 days. Kosoko fled into exile. Akitoye was installed. Within 12 years, Lagos had been formally annexed as a British colony. The bombardment of Lagos in 1851 is not usually where histories of the scramble for Africa begin. The scramble is usually dated to the 1880s, to the Berlin Conference, to the formal division of the continent among European powers. But Kosoko's story is worth beginning with because it illustrates something that the conference room diplomacy of Berlin tends to obscure. The scramble did not begin in Berlin. It began on the ground, in dozens of encounters like Lagos, where commercial interest, naval power, and the vocabulary of civilization combined to produce outcomes that had been largely decided before any formal agreement was reached in any European capital. Berlin did not invent European colonialism in Africa. By the time the delegates gathered in Otto von Bismarck's chancellery on the 15th of November, 1884, Europeans had been trading with, raiding, and in some coastal areas governing parts of Africa for 4 centuries. What the conference attempted to do was regulate the competition between European powers for African territory in a way that reduced the risk of those powers going to war with each other over their African ambitions. Not a single African was in the room. The mechanism the conference established was straightforward in its design and vast in its consequences. Any European power wishing to claim sovereignty over African territory had to demonstrate effective occupation of that territory and notify the other powers. The interior of the continent, which most European powers had barely explored, let alone administered, was effectively declared available for whoever could get there first. What followed was the scramble for Africa, a period of roughly 30 years in which the entire continent was divided among European powers at a speed and with a thoroughness that had no precedent in the history of colonialism. Britain's role in this process was central. By the time the scramble was complete, around 1914, Britain controlled territories stretching in an almost continuous band from Egypt in the north toward South Africa in the south, with major additions in West Africa, including Nigeria and the Gold Coast, and in East Africa, including Kenya and Uganda. The map of British Africa encompassed a territory many times larger than Britain itself, containing tens of millions of people speaking hundreds of languages, organized into thousands of distinct political entities that British administration would spend the next half-century attempting to govern as though they were coherent administrative units. They were not coherent administrative units. They were arbitrary divisions of an enormously complex human geography, drawn by men in European offices who had maps of varying accuracy and no particular reason to care whether the lines they drew corresponded to anything meaningful on the ground. The specific consequences of that arbitrary division are not ancient history. They are the political geography of contemporary Africa, and understanding the former requires taking the latter seriously. Consider Nigeria. The territory that became Nigeria was home to hundreds of ethnic groups speaking more than 500 languages, organized under political systems that had almost nothing in common with each other. In the north, the Sokoto Caliphate was a sophisticated Islamic state with centuries of administrative tradition. In the southwest, the Yoruba kingdoms had their own complex political structures. In the southeast, the Igbo people were organized through village republics and councils of elders rather than centralized kingdoms. These systems had different legal traditions, different economic organizations, different religious frameworks, and different histories of interaction with each other, including histories of conflict that preceded British arrival by centuries. In 1914, the British administrator Lord Frederick Lugard amalgamated the various British protectorates and colonies in the region into a single entity called Nigeria, named after the Niger River by a journalist named Flora Shaw, who later married Lugard. The amalgamation was not done because the peoples of the region had expressed a desire for political unity. It was done because administering separate northern and southern protectorates was expensive, and combining them allowed the revenues of the more commercially developed South to subsidize the costs of governing the North. It was an accounting decision. It created a country. Nigeria today is the most populous nation in Africa, a country of more than 200 million people navigating the inherited consequences of that accounting decision. The tensions between North and South, between different ethnic and religious communities, that have shaped Nigerian politics since independence in 1960 are not simply the result of post-colonial choices. They are built into the foundation of the state itself, into lines that were drawn without consultation with the people those lines would govern. The case of Kenya illustrates a different dimension of the same problem. The British presence in Kenya developed from coastal trading settlements into a full colonial administration following the construction of the Uganda Railway in the 1890s. The railway, built substantially with Indian indentured labor, opened the interior of East Africa to British settlement and commerce. What followed was a land appropriation of considerable scale. The fertile highlands of central Kenya, known to the settler community as the White Highlands, were declared crown land and made available for European settlement. The Kikuyu, Maasai, and other peoples who had farmed and grazed those lands were removed, relocated to reserves, and converted into a labor force for the settlers who now occupied their former territories. By the 1940s, a Kikuyu political and cultural movement was developing that would eventually express itself as the Mau Mau Uprising of the 1950s. The uprising was met by the British colonial administration with a counterinsurgency operation that the historian Caroline Elkins documented in her Pulitzer Prize-winning account, published in 2005. Her research, drawing on colonial records and interviews with survivors, described systematic torture, mass detention, and killings on a scale that the British government had actively worked to conceal. The detention camps, in which tens of thousands of Kikuyu were held, and the systematic use of violence during interrogations, were documented in files held at a secure British government facility called Hanslope Park. Those files were not released, and their existence was officially denied, until a legal case brought by surviving Mau Mau detainees in 2011 forced the government to acknowledge that approximately 1,500 files relating to colonial Kenya had been secretly retained rather than transferred to the Kenyan government at independence. In 2013, the British government agreed to pay compensation to more than 5,000 Kenyan survivors of documented abuse during the Mau Mau period. The settlement was accompanied by an expression of regret. The case of Zimbabwe adds another dimension. The territory that is now Zimbabwe was occupied by Cecil Rhodes's British South Africa Company in the 1890s through a combination of treaty, armed conquest, and the suppression of two major uprisings. Rhodes stated his vision without circumspection: British settlement from the Cape to Cairo, with the resources of Africa organized for British benefit. When the white minority government of Ian Smith declared unilateral independence from Britain in 1965, rather than accept majority rule, the British response was economic sanctions rather than military force. Historians have debated whether this response was adequate to the situation, with some arguing that military intervention was both justified and possible, and others maintaining that the logistical and political constraints on British action were genuine. What is not disputed is that the settler government survived for another 15 years, and that a liberation war with significant human cost followed before the Lancaster House Agreement of 1979 produced the transition to majority rule and the independent Zimbabwe of 1980. Sudan illustrates yet another dimension of the same inheritance. The long conflict between North and South Sudan, which eventually produced the independent state of South Sudan in 2011, at the cost of decades of war and millions of lives, developed within borders and administrative arrangements that British colonial policy had shaped in ways that made sustainable, unified governance structurally difficult from the beginning. The deeper point that runs through all these cases is one that Kwame Nkrumah articulated more clearly than almost anyone else. Nkrumah called it neocolonialism, the situation in which a state has formal political independence but lacks the economic independence that would make political independence substantive. He argued that the forms of colonialism could change while the substance of the relationship remained the same, with African economies continuing to produce raw materials for European markets and African governments continuing to service debts to European financial institutions. The concept remains contested among economists and historians. There are serious scholars who argue that post-colonial development failures in African states are primarily the result of post-independence choices rather than inherited structures. There are equally serious scholars who argue that the inherited structures set constraints on those choices that have not been adequately accounted for. The debate is genuine and the evidence is complex. What is not contested is that the lines drawn at Berlin and in the colonial offices and administrative conferences of the following 30 years are still the political map of Africa today. Kosoko, who was driven from Lagos by British gunfire in 1851, eventually returned. He negotiated with the British, reached an accommodation, and spent the last years of his life on the island he had once ruled. He died in 1872, 2 years before the Scramble for Africa formally began. He had watched the process start. He did not live to see where it would end. The lines that were drawn after his time are still there. The people living within them are still navigating the consequences of decisions made without them. And the empire that drew those lines was about to ask something from those same people that it had never asked before. Not just territory, not just tribute. It was about to ask for blood. Chapter 8. The Empire Goes to War, World War I. World War II. And the soldiers nobody thanked. There is a cemetery in northern France, near the town of Neuve-Chapelle, that most visitors to the Western Front battlefields walk past without stopping. It is not the largest cemetery in the region. It does not have the overwhelming scale of Tynecott or the symbolic weight of Thiepval, but it contains something that the more famous memorials do not foreground in quite the same way. The names on the headstones are Indian. The men buried at Neuve-Chapelle died in March of 1915. In one of the first major offensive operations the British Army undertook on the Western Front, the Indian Corps, which had arrived in France in the autumn of 1914, fought alongside British divisions and took casualties that, proportionally, matched anything the British units beside them suffered. They had come from Punjab, from Garhwal, from Gurkha villages in Nepal. They had crossed 2 oceans to fight in a war whose origins lay entirely in European dynastic and nationalist politics. They had done so because they were subjects of the British Empire, because their rulers had committed their service, and because the structures of the empire they lived within left them, in practice, with very limited choices about the matter. When Britain declared war on Germany on the 4th of August, 1914, it declared war on behalf of the entire empire. The Dominions, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and South Africa, had their own governments but no independent foreign policy. A British declaration of war was automatically a declaration of war for all of them. The response from the settler dominions was, at least initially, largely enthusiastic. The idea of coming to the defense of the mother country drew on genuine sentiment among populations that were predominantly of British descent and that had been raised within a cultural framework positioning Britain as home even for people who had never been there. The volunteer armies that streamed to recruiting offices in Sydney and Melbourne, in Toronto and Vancouver, in Auckland and Wellington, in the months after August of 1914, were in many cases men acting on genuine conviction. What they found when they got to the Western Front, or to Gallipoli, or to Mesopotamia, was not what most of them had imagined. The Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, whose initials gave the world the word Anzac, landed on the Gallipoli Peninsula on the 25th of April, 1915, in an operation whose planning combined strategic ambition with operational miscalculation in proportions that military historians still debate. The landing was in the wrong place. The terrain was far more difficult than the planners had anticipated. The Ottoman defenders fought with a determination and skill that made the entire campaign a grinding, bloody failure. By the time the Allied forces were evacuated in December of 1915 and January of 1916, more than 8,000 Australians and 2,700 New Zealanders were dead. Gallipoli became, for Australia and New Zealand, the foundational national myth. The Anzac legend shaped national identity in both countries in ways that persisted for a century and that planted seeds of gradual separation from British imperial identity that would take decades to fully develop. The story of Indian soldiers followed a completely different trajectory. India contributed more than 1.5 million soldiers to the British war effort between 1914 and 1918. They served on the Western Front, at Gallipoli, in Mesopotamia, in East Africa, and in Palestine. Indian soldiers were awarded hundreds of medals for valor. Indian labor battalions, Merchant Marines, and supply operations supported British military operations across multiple theaters. The Indian National Congress made a deliberate decision in 1914 to support the British war effort. The calculation was that demonstrated loyalty during the war would strengthen the case for significant political reform afterward. Gandhi himself supported the war effort in its early stages, including organizing medical assistance. The expectation was not naive. The British government had issued statements during the war, acknowledging the goal of increasing Indian participation in governance. These were significant words. They were not a promise of independence, but they were an acknowledgement that the status quo could not be permanent. What happened after the war tested whether those words had any real meaning. The Rowlatt Act of 1919, which extended wartime emergency powers into peacetime and allowed detention without trial, was the British government's answer. It was passed over the unanimous opposition of every Indian member of the Imperial Legislative Council. The protests that followed led directly to the Amritsar massacre of April of 1919. General Reginald Dyer ordered his troops to fire without warning into a crowd of unarmed civilians gathered in the Jallianwala Bagh, an enclosed garden in Amritsar. The crowd had gathered for a public meeting in defiance of an order that many were unaware had been issued. The garden's enclosed walls meant there was almost nowhere to run. Dyer ordered his men to continue firing until the ammunition was nearly exhausted. The firing lasted approximately 10 minutes. The official British death toll was 379. Indian National Congress investigations placed the figure considerably higher. Dyer was eventually removed from command. He was never prosecuted. A fund, organized by a British newspaper, raised a substantial sum for him as a public expression of support. The message delivered to the Indian population about the value the empire placed on the service of the previous 4 years was unmistakable. When Britain declared war on Germany on the 3rd of September, 1939, the situation of the empire was already fundamentally different from 1914. The Viceroy of India, Lord Linlithgow, declared war on behalf of India on the 3rd of September, 1939. Without consulting a single Indian political leader, the Indian National Congress, now a mass movement with genuine popular support across the subcontinent, responded by withdrawing its ministers from the provincial governments they had been participating in. If India was to be committed to a war for freedom and democracy without consultation with its own people, the Congress was not going to pretend the commitment had been made with consent. Churchill, who became Prime Minister in May of 1940, held views on India that were among the most resistant to change of any major British politician of his generation. In August of 1942, the Congress launched the Quit India movement, demanding immediate British withdrawal as a condition for Indian cooperation with the war effort. The British response was the arrest of Gandhi, Nehru, and virtually the entire Congress leadership, who spent the remainder of the war in prison. India still contributed what many historians describe as the largest volunteer army of the Second World War. Though scholars continue to discuss the nature of voluntarism in a colonial context where economic necessity and social structures shaped enlistment in ways that complicate straightforward comparisons, those soldiers fought in North Africa, in Italy, in Burma, in the Middle East. They fought alongside British soldiers, under the same strategic command, against the same enemies. They did so while their political leaders were in prison, while a famine was killing millions of their countrymen in Bengal, and while the government that commanded their service was resisting with every political resource available to it the idea that they had the right to determine their own future. The contribution of African soldiers to both world wars is even less recognized in popular historical memory. In the First World War, more than 1 million Africans from British territories served as soldiers or carriers. The men who moved supplies through terrain where wheeled transport was impossible, the Carrier Corps in East Africa, which supported the campaign against German forces in what is now Tanzania, suffered catastrophic losses from disease and exhaustion in conditions that attracted far less official concern than the welfare of combat soldiers. In the Second World War, soldiers from Nigeria, the Gold Coast, Kenya, and other British African territories served in campaigns across Africa, the Middle East, and Burma. The Royal West African Frontier Force and the King's African Rifles fought in conditions of extreme difficulty, far from any territory whose defense might have seemed to justify the sacrifice to the men being asked to make it. The men of the Caribbean also served in both wars, in numbers that, relative to the small populations of the islands involved, represented an extraordinary proportional contribution. Caribbean men served in the Royal Air Force during the Second World War, at a time when racial segregation was still formal policy in the American military. They flew and navigated aircraft in a war against a regime whose racial ideology, their own governments, had not entirely escaped in their treatment of colonial subjects. When the war ended in 1945, the question of what these contributions meant for the political future of the empire was unavoidable. The Atlantic Charter of 1941, signed by Churchill and American President Franklin Roosevelt, had declared that the Allied powers respected the right of all peoples to choose the form of government under which they wished to live. Churchill subsequently argued that the charter applied to European peoples under Nazi occupation and not to the peoples of the British Empire. The soldiers from Punjab and Lagos in Jamaica who had fought in the Allied armies did not find that interpretation persuasive. They had been asked to fight for freedom. They had done so. The question now was whether the freedom they had fought for applied to them. In the service records of Nigerian soldiers who served in the Burma campaign, the information recorded is precise and consistent: name, rank, unit, service number, dates. The forms had columns for everything the army needed to know to deploy a man, supply him, and account for him if he died. There was no column for what he thought, no column for what he expected when he came home, no column for what the word freedom meant to him when he heard it in speeches delivered by men who governed his country without his consent. The empire recorded what it needed. It left everything else out. That silence would not last much longer. Chapter 9. The Beginning of the End. Gandhi, Nationalism, and the Idea That Spread. In the early hours of the 12th of March, 1930, a 60-year-old man walked out of his ashram near Ahmedabad in western India and began walking toward the sea. He was small and thin, wearing a simple white garment and carrying a walking staff. Behind him walked 78 followers. The British administration in India was aware of his departure. The Viceroy, Lord Irwin, had been warned that the planned action might cause difficulties. He was not, in the accounts of those who observed the administration's reaction, particularly alarmed. 24 days later, after walking 240 miles through Indian villages where crowds gathered to watch him pass, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi reached the shore at Dandi. He bent down and picked up a handful of salt from the mud flats. The action that had seemed so simple, so almost absurd in its symbolism, had by that moment become a global news event. International journalists had walked alongside the march. The images traveled by telegraph to newspapers across the world. In London, the government that had dismissed the whole exercise as theater found itself looking at photographs that told a story the government had not intended anyone to see. An old man in a white garment, walking to the sea to pick up salt, surrounded by the machinery of a vast empire, trying to decide how to respond. The salt tax seems, on first examination, like an odd fulcrum for a mass movement. Salt was a basic necessity. The British colonial government held a monopoly on its production and sale, and taxed it in a way that fell most heavily on the poorest members of Indian society. Gandhi had chosen salt deliberately. He understood something about the symbolic power of specificity that more conventionally minded political strategists sometimes missed. An abstract argument about constitutional rights reaches primarily those already engaged with political philosophy. An argument about the right to pick up salt from the ground where the sea and sun have produced it, without paying a tax to a government in London for the privilege, reaches everyone who has ever paid that tax and known, in some wordless way, that it was wrong. The genius of the Salt March was that it made the injustice of colonial rule visible and tangible to anyone who looked at it. When the colonial administration responded by arresting Gandhi and eventually imprisoning more than 60,000 people who joined the civil disobedience campaign that followed, it demonstrated something equally important. A government that must imprison 60,000 of its own subjects to maintain a tax on salt does not have the consent of the governed. It has the capacity for coercion. Those are not the same thing, and the difference between them had become, by 1930, increasingly visible to audiences well beyond India. Gandhi had developed the philosophy and tactics of what he called satyagraha, a Sanskrit term usually translated as truth force. In South Africa, between 1906 and 1915, the core of the approach was the deliberate acceptance of suffering in the service of truth. The willingness to endure punishment without retaliation in a way that exposed the moral bankruptcy of the power inflicting it. It required extraordinary discipline and courage, and it was designed to work specifically against a power that retained some residual concern for its own moral reputation, that could be shamed, that had audiences at home and internationally who would eventually react to images of peaceful protesters being beaten and imprisoned. The British Empire was exactly that kind of power. It had a free press at home. It had a parliament that asked questions. It had an educated public that had been raised on the story of empire as a civilizing mission and that was capable of noticing when the civilizing mission involved arresting a 70-year-old man for picking up salt. The political consequence of the Salt March was not immediate independence. The British government responded with the Government of India Act of 1935, which extended significant provincial autonomy while retaining British control at the center. It was a substantial reform. It was also, as Gandhi and Nehru both recognized, a strategy designed to reduce political pressure without actually transferring power. But the direction of travel had been established in a way that could not be reversed. After 1930, the question was not whether India would become independent. It was when and on what terms. The answer to that question was determined less by British generosity than by the exhaustion of British capacity after the Second World War. Britain emerged from the war victorious in the narrow military sense and devastated in almost every other. The national debt had reached levels that made the pre-war empire economically unsustainable. The country was dependent on American loans to keep its own economy functioning. The Labor government that came to power in July of 1945 had domestic priorities: the National Health Service, the welfare state, the reconstruction of bombed cities that competed directly with the costs of maintaining control over restless populations on the other side of the world. Clement Attlee, who replaced Churchill as prime minister, was a pragmatist who understood that Indian political mobilization, British economic weakness, and the changed international expectations of a post-war world had made the continuation of the Raj politically and financially untenable. He sent Lord Louis Mountbatten to India as the last viceroy in March of 1947, with instructions to arrange the transfer of power as quickly as possible. What followed was both a remarkable political achievement and a catastrophe of almost incomprehensible human scale. The partition of British India into the independent states of India and Pakistan, which took effect on the 14th and 15th of August, 1947, was the messiest, most consequential, and most contested legacy of British rule on the subcontinent. The line dividing the two new states was drawn by a British lawyer named Cyril Radcliffe, who had never previously been to India, and who was given 5 weeks to divide a subcontinent of 300 million people along religious lines. The line was announced on the 17th of August, 2 days after independence, meaning that people in affected communities had been celebrating the end of colonial rule without knowing which country they were now citizens of. What followed was one of the largest forced migrations in human history. Between 10 and 20 million people moved across the new borders in both directions, in conditions of violence that the departing British administration lacked both the capacity and, in many cases, the will to prevent. The death toll has never been precisely established. Estimates range from 200,000 to 1 million, with the scholarly consensus settling somewhere in that range. Though the historian Yasmin Khan, in her detailed account, published in 2007, emphasizes that The imprecision of the numbers reflects the chaos of events rather than any uncertainty about whether the violence was catastrophic. Trains arrived at their destinations carrying only bodies. Villages that had been home to mixed communities for generations were destroyed in days. The British left. The killing continued. The partition of India did not end the imperial crisis. It demonstrated, in the most brutal terms available, what happened when an empire that had governed without consent attempted to leave without adequate preparation. In the Gold Coast, Kwame Nkrumah returned from his education in the United States and Britain in 1947 and began organizing a mass movement for independence. He was imprisoned by the colonial government in 1950. When his party won the election held while he was in jail, the British released him and made him prime minister. In 1957, the Gold Coast became Ghana, the first sub-Saharan African country to achieve independence from colonial rule. Nkrumah understood what his independence meant beyond Ghana's borders. He said explicitly that the independence of Ghana was meaningless unless it was linked to the total liberation of Africa. He was not just leading a country, he was demonstrating a possibility. In Kenya, in Malaya, in Cyprus, in Nigeria, in Rhodesia, the same idea was taking hold. The specific circumstances varied. The British response varied between reluctant negotiation and determined violence. But the direction of movement was consistent and, by the late 1950s, unstoppable. Harold Macmillan, who became British Prime Minister in 1957, gave a speech in Cape Town in February of 1960 that captured the political reality with a directness unusual in the language of British official discourse. The wind of change, he told the South African Parliament, is blowing through this continent, whether we like it or not. This growth of national consciousness is a political fact. The speech was addressed to South Africa, whose apartheid government was not going to be moved by it. But its significance was broader. The Prime Minister of Britain was publicly acknowledging that the end of empire was not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be managed. Between 1957 and 1968, the majority of British African territories became independent countries. The empire was ending. The idea that had begun with one old man walking toward the sea had traveled faster and further than the men who fired on the crowd at Amritsar had imagined possible. The last major test of whether Britain would accept that reality or resist it at catastrophic cost was not in Asia or Africa. It was in Egypt, and it would reveal. In the space of a few weeks, in the autumn of 1956, something about Britain that the country has been processing ever since. Chapter 10. Suez in the Mirror, the moment Britain saw itself clearly. November 1956. A British Prime Minister is sitting in a room at 10 Downing Street, receiving news that the operation he has staked his career, his reputation, and his country's international standing on is over. Not because the military had failed. The military had performed exactly as ordered. It was over because the Americans had said no. Anthony Eden had been Foreign Secretary for years before he became Prime Minister. He had negotiated with some of the most formidable figures of the 20th century. He knew the diplomatic world with a precision and a confidence that most politicians never acquire. He believed, with a conviction he had never seriously examined, that Britain was a power whose interests demanded to be treated with the respect that great powers commanded. In the space of 1 week in November of 1956, that belief was taken apart in public, in a way that left nothing intact. To understand what happened at Suez, You have to understand what Britain believed about itself in the mid-1950s. The country had emerged from the Second World War on the winning side. Churchill's wartime leadership had become the defining story of modern British identity. Britain had a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council. It had nuclear weapons. It still had an empire. Diminished but substantial. The idea that Britain might no longer be a first-rank power, that it might be in a different category from the United States and the Soviet Union rather than alongside them, was a thought that most of the British political establishment was not yet ready to think. Then Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. Nasser was the leader of the Egyptian government that had overthrown the British-backed monarchy in 1952. He was a nationalist in the most direct sense, a man who believed that Egyptian resources and Egyptian territory should serve Egyptian interests. In July of 1956, following the American and British withdrawal of an offer to fund the Aswan High Dam, he nationalized the canal. Egypt would operate it. Egypt would collect the revenues. Eden told his cabinet that Nasser could not be allowed to have his hand on Britain's windpipe. The canal was the artery through which British trade and British military logistics flowed between Europe and Asia. More than that, allowing an Egyptian leader to simply take what he wanted from British and French interests was the kind of precedent Eden believed would encourage nationalist challenges to remaining British interests across the Middle East and beyond. The thinking was not irrational on its own terms. The problem was that those terms were approximately 30 years out of date. Britain's economy was dependent on American financial support. Its military could not project force against determined opposition without American logistical backing. And the United States, under President Dwight Eisenhower, had made clear in the post-war years that it did not support European colonial operations that complicated American relationships with the emerging nations of Asia and Africa. Eden knew this. His cabinet knew this. And yet the knowledge was not sufficient to change the course that British pride was driving toward. In October of 1956, Britain and France reached a secret agreement with Israel, negotiated at a villa in the Paris suburb of Sèvres, committed to paper in a document that the British government subsequently denied existed for more than 30 years. Israel would attack Egypt across the Sinai Peninsula. Britain and France would then issue an ultimatum, demanding that both sides withdraw from the Canal Zone. When Egypt refused, as it certainly would, British and French forces would intervene militarily to, in the language of the cover story, separate the combatants and protect the canal. The cover story was transparently false. The intervention was not peacekeeping. It was the use of Israeli military action as a pretext for Franco-British reassertion of control over a canal that Egypt had legally nationalized. The operation began on the 29th of October. Britain and France issued their ultimatum. Egypt refused. On the 31st of October, British and French aircraft began bombing Egyptian airfields. In Washington, Eisenhower was furious. He had not been consulted. He had not been warned. He was in the middle of a presidential election campaign, and his closest ally had just launched a colonial military operation in the Middle East that contradicted everything Eisenhower had been saying about American foreign policy. More importantly, he understood something Eden had failed to calculate. The Soviet Union was simultaneously crushing the Hungarian uprising by force. If Western powers were also engaging in military operations to reassert colonial control over a Middle Eastern country, the moral case the West was making against Soviet imperialism collapsed entirely. Eisenhower moved fast. He made clear that American support for the British pound and American support for British access to International Monetary Fund resources was contingent on British withdrawal from Egypt. Britain was running a balance of payments crisis. The pound sterling was under pressure, without American support. The financial consequences were unmanageable. It took 1 week. 1 week from the ultimatum to the ceasefire. 1 week to end an operation that Eden had believed would restore British prestige and demonstrate that the empire still had the capacity to act decisively in its own interests. Eden flew to Jamaica to recover from what was officially described as illness, but what those around him understood as a collapse, physical and psychological, brought on by the destruction of everything he had believed about his country and its place in the world. He resigned in January of 1957. He never returned to major political life. The canal stayed Egyptian. What the Suez Crisis had done was simple and devastating. It had demonstrated, without any possibility of ambiguity, that Britain could not act as a first-rank power against determined American opposition. The special relationship between Britain and America was real, but it was a relationship between unequal partners, and the inequality had been made visible in the most public and humiliating way imaginable. The historian Keith Kyle, in his comprehensive account published in 1991, describes Suez as the moment that ended the era of British imperial autonomy. But Suez meant something beyond its strategic consequences. It meant something about the story. The story Britain had been telling itself was that British experience, British judgment, and British prestige gave Britain a role in world affairs that was independent of the raw calculations of economic and military power. The story was that what Britain had been, a civilization that had governed a quarter of the earth, conferred a status that outlasted the empire itself. Suez showed that the story was not true, not in any way that mattered when decisions had to be made and consequences had to be absorbed. In some ways, Britain is still processing that. What Suez did, practically and immediately, was accelerate decolonization. If Britain could not sustain a military operation against a middle-rank power without American permission, the argument for maintaining expensive colonial administrations across Africa and Asia became almost impossible to make. The empire was not just ending at Suez. It had looked at itself in the mirror for the first time in decades. The reflection was not what the story had promised. And, somewhere in the territories that still flew the British flag, people who had been waiting for exactly this moment began to move faster. The question of when an empire stops being progress and starts being something else entirely had, by 1956, answered itself. The only thing left was the accounting, and that accounting was going to be very long and very incomplete, and in many cases, it is still ongoing. Chapter 11. Decolonization, messy, incomplete, and still ongoing. Independence is a word that suggests a clean break, a moment when one thing ends and another begins, a line on the calendar that divides the before from the after. The history of British decolonization suggests that independence is almost never that clean. It is a process rather than a moment, a renegotiation of relationships that were built over decades and that do not dissolve simply because a new flag is raised and a new government takes its oath of office. To understand why, you have to look at specific cases, not as a list of territories and dates, but as human situations that were shaped by specific decisions and that left behind specific consequences that are still unfolding today. Begin with Palestine, and with a man named Isa al-Isa. Isa al-Isa was the founder and editor of a Palestinian Arabic newspaper called Filastin, established in 1911. He spent his career documenting what was happening in the territory where he lived, writing about the changes in land ownership, the shifts in the political landscape, the growing tensions between different communities. He was not a figure of mythology. He was a working journalist trying to make sense of an increasingly complicated situation in his homeland. His newspaper published for decades, through some of the most turbulent years in Palestinian history, until the events of 1948 made its continuation impossible. The situation he had spent his career trying to make sense of had its roots in contradictions that Britain had created and never resolved. The Balfour Declaration of 1917 had expressed British support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. The Hussein McMahon Correspondence of 1915 and 1916 had made commitments to Arab leaders that, in Arab reading, included Palestine within the territory of an independent Arab state. Historians continue to debate the precise scope of those commitments and whether Palestine was definitively included or ambiguously addressed. The point of agreement is that the commitments pointed in incompatible directions and that Britain made no serious attempt to reconcile them while it held power. For 28 years, Britain administered Palestine under a League of Nations mandate while the contradictions deepened. By 1947, Britain was spending more on maintaining order in Palestine than the territory could possibly justify economically. Britain referred the Palestine question to the newly formed United Nations in February of 1947 and announced its intention to withdraw by May of 1948. The United Nations produced a partition plan in November of 1947. Jewish leaders accepted it. Arab leaders and Arab states rejected it. Before the British withdrawal was complete, fighting between Jewish and Arab forces had already begun. On the 14th of May, 1948, the day the British mandate formally ended, the State of Israel was proclaimed. The Arab-Israeli war that followed resulted in the displacement of approximately 700,000 Palestinian Arabs, in what Palestinians call the Nakba, meaning the catastrophe. The political geography that was created in those months, shaped substantially by British decisions made during and after the First World War, remains one of the most contested in the world. The contradictions of the Mandate period still shape a political geography in which people continue to die. Britain did not cause all of this. The history of the region is ancient and complex, and involves the agency and choices of many peoples and many governments. But Britain created the specific framework within which these events developed, made promises it could not simultaneously keep, and departed before any sustainable resolution had been reached, now moved to Iraq, and to a different set of lines drawn by the same hands. The territory that became Iraq was assembled by Britain from 3 former Ottoman provinces: Mosul in the north, Baghdad in the center, and Basra in the south, without meaningful reference to the ethnic, religious, and cultural geography of the region. The predominantly Kurdish and Yazidi communities of the north, the Sunni Arab center, and the Shia Arab south were combined into a single state and given a king imported from the Arabian Peninsula. In the villages of the northern provinces, families who had lived within their own distinct cultural and linguistic communities for generations suddenly found themselves citizens of a new country whose political center was far away and whose dominant political culture was not their information own. The colonial administrative record documents this transition with the calm precision of bureaucratic habit, recording boundaries, populations, administrative districts, all the information needed to govern a territory, while leaving almost entirely unrecorded what the people within those boundaries thought about the arrangement being imposed on them. The political instability that followed, across decades of coups and conflicts, and ultimately years of devastating violence. Developed within borders and administrative arrangements that British decisions had shaped in ways that made sustainable, unified governance structurally difficult from the beginning. Now moved to the Indian Ocean, and to a woman named Rita Bancoult. Rita Bancoult was born on Diego Garcia, the largest island of the Chagos archipelago. In 1943, she grew up there. She raised her children there. Her family had lived on the islands for generations, part of a community called the Chagosians, who had developed their own culture, their own Creole language, their own way of life on these remote islands in the middle of the Indian Ocean. In the 1960s, Britain negotiated an agreement with the United States for a joint military base on Diego Garcia. The Chagosians were in the way. Between 1968 and 1973, the entire Chagosian population was forcibly removed from their islands. They were transported to Mauritius and the Seychelles, where they arrived without adequate housing, without adequate support, and without any clear legal pathway back to the islands they had left. British officials, in documents that became public through subsequent court cases, described the inhabitants in terms that made clear the contempt with which their interests had been regarded. Rita Bancoult spent the rest of her life fighting for the right to return. Her son Olivier Bancoult became the leader of the Chagos Refugees Group, which has pursued legal cases in British courts for decades. In 2019, the International Court of Justice issued an advisory opinion that Britain's continued administration of the Chagos Islands was unlawful and that the islands should be returned to Mauritius. The United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution to the same effect. Britain's compliance with that ruling has remained politically and legally contested. Before this documentary is published, the current status of that situation should be verified. As it continues to develop, the Bancoult family's fight is still ongoing. Now move to Southeast Asia, and to the communities documented in the Malayan Emergency Resettlement Records. The Malayan Emergency, as the British government called it, avoiding the word war because the insurers of British rubber plantations would not pay out on war-related damage, was a counterinsurgency campaign against a predominantly Chinese Malayan communist movement that lasted from 1948 to 1960. The British response involved the forced resettlement of more than 500,000 rural Chinese Malayan farmers into fortified villages called new villages. Among those relocated were farming families recorded in colonial resettlement files with the bureaucratic precision of an administration that documented addresses, household sizes, and relocation dates with considerable care, while recording almost nothing of what those families understood to be happening to them or what they believed they had lost. Those families arrived at new villages built on land they had not chosen, surrounded by barbed wire and subject to curfews that restricted their movement for years. The resettlement was coercive. The people being moved had no meaningful choice in the matter. Malaya became independent in 1957. The campaign was described by the British military as a successful counterinsurgency model. What the model demonstrated was that pacification and political transition could be combined in ways that produced a stable independent state. What it also demonstrated was that the methods used to achieve that stability, including forced population movement, detention without trial, and the systematic disruption of established communities, were practices that British governments have been more willing to discuss in strategic than in human terms. Now consider Cyprus, and the particular way British policy left that island divided. The Greek Cypriot organization, EOKA, seeking union with Greece, launched an armed campaign against British rule in 1955 The British response included detention without trial, collective punishment of villages, and practices documented by the European Commission on Human Rights that fell short of the rule of law standards Britain publicly proclaimed. Equally significant was British policy toward the relationship between the Greek Cypriot majority and the Turkish Cypriot minority. The deliberate encouragement of communal tension as an instrument of political management created a situation that outlasted British rule by decades. Cyprus became independent in 1960 under arrangements that were structurally unstable. The communal tensions that colonial policy had exacerbated contributed to the violent intercommunal conflict of the early 1960s and ultimately to the Turkish military intervention of 1974, which divided the island along lines that remain in place today. The question of reparations for slavery and colonial violence is the dimension of decolonization that is most politically contested in contemporary debate. In Kingston, Jamaica, there is a historian named Vereen Shepherd who has spent decades tracing the names of enslaved people in colonial documents that were not designed to preserve them as full human beings, but that preserve them nonetheless. In the margins of account books, and in the records of baptisms, and in the inventories of human beings assessed as property. She has said in interviews that the reparations debate is not primarily about money. It is about acknowledgement. It is about whether the full story of how the modern world was built will be told, or whether it will continue to be told in the version that leaves out the people whose labor and whose suffering built the most profitable parts of it. The Caribbean community, known as CARICOM, formally requested reparatory justice from European colonial powers in 2013. The British government's response has been to decline engagement with the reparations framework while expressing general regret about historical slavery. The counter-arguments to reparations are serious and deserve honest engagement. The question of which present-day entities bear legal and moral responsibility for actions taken by governments and private actors centuries ago is genuinely complex. The question of how transfers would be calculated and distributed raises practical difficulties that are not trivial. The question of whether financial transfers would actually address the structural inequalities they are intended to remedy is one that economists and historians disagree about. But the debate is real, and it is intensifying. Academic institutions, including Cambridge and Oxford, have conducted audits of their historical connections to slavery and colonial wealth. The Church of England has committed to a substantial fund to address its historical involvement in slavery. Several Caribbean nations have made formal diplomatic representations. The political landscape on this question is shifting in ways that were not predictable a decade ago. Decolonization is not finished. The Chagassians are still fighting. The reparations debate is unresolved. The borders drawn at Berlin are still the political map of Africa. The contradictions of the Mandate period still shape a political geography in which people continue to die. The British Empire is over in the formal sense. Its consequences are not. And in the organization that replaced the empire, the Commonwealth of Nations, those consequences are present in every meeting, in every communique, in every photograph of leaders gathered under a banner that uses the word free without always examining what that word has meant in practice. Chapter 12. The Commonwealth Empire by Another Name, or Something Genuinely New. On the 29th of June, 2018, a woman named Paulette Wilson sat in the public gallery of the British House of Commons and listened to the Home Secretary apologize. Paulette Wilson had come to Britain from Jamaica in 1968 at the age of 10. As part of a generation of Caribbean migrants who had been explicitly invited to help rebuild the country after the Second World War. She had lived in Britain for 50 years. She had worked in Britain, paid taxes in Britain, raised her family in Britain. She had never applied for British citizenship because she had been told, and had every reason to believe, that she did not need to. She had arrived legally. She had the right to be there. In 2017, the Home Office informed her that she was an illegal immigrant and that she faced deportation to a country she had left as a child and had not returned to in half a century. She was not alone. The Windrush Scandal, named after the ship Empire Windrush that had brought one of the first large groups of Caribbean migrants to Britain in 1948, affected hundreds and possibly thousands of people from the Caribbean who had come to Britain legally under the British Nationality Act of 1948, which had granted them the right to live and work in the United Kingdom as citizens of the British Empire and Commonwealth. Decades later, the British government had lost or destroyed the landing cards that documented their legal arrival. A hostile environment policy designed to make life difficult for undocumented immigrants had swept up people who were not undocumented at all. People who had every legal right to be in Britain but could not prove it because the government had failed to maintain the records. People lost their jobs. They lost access to the National Health Service. They were detained. Some were deported to Caribbean countries they had not lived in since childhood. According to a government review published in 2019, at least 83 people are confirmed to have been wrongly detained or removed as of that review. Though the true number is likely higher, some died before the situation was resolved. Paulette Wilson died in 2020, 2 years after sitting in that gallery. She had her status restored before she died. She never received compensation. Her story is where this chapter about the Commonwealth has to begin, because it tells you more about the nature of the Commonwealth relationship than any constitutional document or heads of government communique. The Commonwealth of Nations encompasses more than 50 countries on every inhabited continent, representing roughly a third of the world's population. It operates through a secretariat based in London, holds regular heads of government meetings, and runs programs covering trade, development, education, and governance. It has no treaty obligations between its members. It has no mechanism to enforce its stated values of democracy and rule of law on members who violate them. What it is, in the most honest description, is a network built on the infrastructure of a former empire, operating in English, drawing on institutional connections between governments, universities, legal systems, and professional associations that were established during the colonial period and that have proved durable enough to outlast the political relationship that created them. Whether that network constitutes something genuinely valuable or whether it is primarily a vehicle for maintaining British influence in a world that no longer has to take that influence for granted, is a question that its members answer differently depending on which side of the former imperial relationship they stand on. For small island states in the Caribbean and Pacific, Commonwealth membership provides access to diplomatic support, development funding, and institutional expertise that their own size and resources could not generate independently. The Commonwealth Scholarship Program has funded the education of tens of thousands of students from developing countries. These are real benefits that real people have received. India, which provides by far the largest share of the Commonwealth's total population, treats Commonwealth membership as one thread among many in its foreign policy rather than as a defining relationship. The ambivalence is genuine, and it reflects something honest about what the organization is. The monarchy question adds another layer of complexity. 15 of the member states are Commonwealth realms, meaning that the British monarch is also their head of state. Barbados became a republic in 2021. Jamaica has announced its intention to follow. In Australia, the Republic debate has reopened. The question in each case is not primarily about the personal qualities of the monarch. It is about what it means for a country to carry, in its constitutional arrangements, a symbolic connection to the imperial relationship that many of its citizens would prefer to leave behind. New Zealand's Maori communities are divided on the question, with some arguing that the Treaty of Waitangi established a relationship with the Crown that a republic would complicate, while others argue that full sovereignty requires removing the Crown entirely. The debate is real, and it reflects a complexity that neither side can resolve simply by being more insistent. The Windrush scandal illuminated the Commonwealth relationship in its most painful and most precise form. The people who came to Britain from the Caribbean in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s came because they were invited. They came because the empire had told them. Through decades of education in English, through the institutions of the Anglican Church, through the cultural transmission of British identity that colonial education systems deliberately promoted, that Britain was, in some meaningful sense, their country too. They arrived to find a different reality. The racial discrimination that shaped British housing, employment, and social life in those decades was not subtle or marginal. It was a daily education in the gap between the imperial rhetoric of shared British identity and the actual social reality of post-war Britain. The first generation navigated that gap with resilience and community solidarity. Their children and grandchildren became British in every meaningful sense of the word. And then, 50 and 60 years after they arrived, the state that had invited them decided to ask them to prove it. Paulette Wilson sat in the gallery of the House of Commons and listened to an apology. The apology was delivered with apparent sincerity. It did not bring back what had been taken from her. It did not restore the years of uncertainty, the job she had lost, the fear she had lived with. It did not address how the same government that was apologizing had designed and implemented the policy that made the apology necessary. The Commonwealth, in the aftermath of Windrush, faces a question it has never adequately answered. What does equal partnership actually mean between countries whose relationship was defined for generations by domination and extraction, and whose people can still, decades after independence, have their British residency rights erased by administrative indifference? The organization exists. The meetings happen. The scholarships are awarded. The cricket is played, sometimes brilliantly, between countries whose relationship with each other was forged in conditions that cricket does not fully capture. Whether the Commonwealth represents a genuine new beginning or the most recent form of a relationship that has simply found more comfortable language for its inequality is a question that the member nations are still answering. The answer is not the same from London as it is from Kingston. It is not the same from Canberra as it is from Nairobi. That diversity of answers is itself the most honest description of what the Commonwealth is. It is not the empire. It is not its opposite. It is the long, unresolved, still contested aftermath of the empire, taking the only institutional form that the participants could agree on at the moment when the empire was ending, and something had to replace it. Whether that form is adequate to the relationship it is supposed to manage is a question that Paulette Wilson, sitting in the gallery of the House of Commons, might have answered differently than the person delivering the apology below her. She knew something about the gap between words and consequences that no official statement had yet bridged. Go back to the map of 1920, with its vast territories of red stretching across continents, from the Canadian tundra to the Australian outback, from the Indian subcontinent to the highlands of Kenya, from the Caribbean islands to the windswept coasts of the Falklands. That red is gone now. The flags have changed. The governments have changed. The names on the official documents have changed. The formal structures of colonial administration are gone. And yet, the line that Cyril Radcliffe drew across the Punjab in 5 weeks in 1947 is still there. It is still one of the most militarized borders on Earth. The two countries it separates have fought multiple wars and both possess nuclear weapons. The people who live within a few miles of that line on either side speak the same language, share the same food, carry the same cultural heritage. The line between them was drawn by a man who had never visited their country before he arrived to divide it. The borders that European powers drew at Berlin in 1884 are still the political map of Africa. The contradictions embedded in those borders have generated conflicts that have killed millions of people since independence. Those borders are the landscape within which those conflicts have unfolded. The contradictions of the Mandate period still shape a political geography in which people continue to die. Rita Bancoult is still waiting. In the country she was taken to, looking across an ocean toward islands she was born on and has not been permitted to return to. These are not matters for the history books. They are happening now, in the same world in which the British Empire is officially over. Officially a matter of historical record. Officially something that belongs to museums and academic conferences. The dissonance between the official status of the empire and the ongoing consequences of what it built is the central tension of the contemporary world's relationship with the British imperial past. How should that dissonance be resolved? That is where serious disagreement begins. And it is where this documentary will not pretend to offer a single answer. Because there is not one. There are those who argue that honest accounting requires substantial material reparation. The argument is that the causal chain from past exploitation to present inequality is sufficiently documented that justice requires more than acknowledgement. There are those who argue that the current generation cannot be held financially responsible for what previous generations did, and that structural change in the international economic system would do more to address present inequalities than transfers between governments. There are those who argue that the focus on reparations and accountability is itself a distraction from the more urgent task of building institutions and policies that actually improve lives in the countries where the consequences of empire are most acute. These arguments are held by real people whose lives are shaped by the questions they are answering. Frayne Shepherd, in her archive in Kingston, tracing names in documents that were not designed to remember them. Rita Bancoult, looking toward islands she cannot reach. The families on both sides of the Radcliffe line, living within a few miles of each other across a division that was made in 5 weeks by a man who flew home as quickly as he could after making it. These people are not abstractions. They are the human content of a history that sometimes gets discussed as though it were purely an intellectual exercise. Britain today contains within its own borders the human consequences of its empire. The Caribbean communities of London and Birmingham and Bristol. The South Asian communities of Leicester and Bradford and East London. The African communities of most major British cities. These communities are there, in large part, because of the empire. Their presence in Britain is not separate from British imperial history. It is its continuation. What can be said, with confidence and with the evidence this documentary has laid out, is this. The British Empire was one of the most consequential political entities in human history. It shaped the modern world in ways that are still operating. It built infrastructure that is still used. It drew borders that are still enforced. It spread a language that is now the closest thing the world has to a common tongue for international communication. It also extracted wealth on a scale that has not been adequately measured, let alone addressed. It deployed violence. systematic and deliberate, in the service of maintaining arrangements that benefited the metropole at the expense of the territories it governed. And it produced, alongside all of that, people of genuine brilliance and genuine good faith who served within it and contributed real things to the territories they worked in. The record contains all of these things. It refuses to be simplified into a single verdict. The British Empire. When the interests of the British state and British commercial interests conflicted with the interests of the people it governed, served the former. That is not a radical claim. It is what empires do. It is, in the end, what the word empire means. The question that has run through this entire story: at what point does an empire stop being progress and start being something else entirely? Perhaps has no single answer, because it was always both things simultaneously. The railway and the famine were not separate chapters in two different stories. They were chapters in the same story, produced by the same system, serving the same fundamental purpose. Understanding that is not a counsel of despair. It is a precondition for honesty. And honesty about what was built and what was taken and what was left behind is the only foundation on which a genuine accounting can take place. The color on the map faded. The lines it drew did not. And the people living within those lines, navigating the borders and the debts and the institutional inheritances and the political geographies that the empire created, are still writing the chapters that come after. Those chapters belong to them. But the story that made them necessary began here, on a small island off the northwest coast of Europe, that decided, one day, that the world was available. The world, it turns out, had always had other ideas. It always does.